The sound of my doorbell ringing at 6:47 a.m. shattered what should have been the first peaceful Saturday morning in my new home. I stumbled to the door in my pajamas, coffee-deprived and confused, to find a woman in a pressed blazer and khaki pants, standing on my porch with a clipboard, and the kind of smile that does not reach the eyes. "I'm Patricia Hendricks, president of the Meadowbrook Estates Homeowners Association," she announced, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "And we need to discuss your severe violations." I blinked at her, still half asleep. "I'm sorry, what?" "Before we dive in, drop a comment below and let me know where you're watching from. I want to know this isn't just happening in my corner of the world. See, here's the thing about HOA Karens. They're a special breed of entitled that defies logic. And Patricia Hendricks was about to become the poster child for what happens when unchecked power meets delusional thinking. Let me back up and paint you a picture of how I got here. 3 months earlier, I'd finally saved enough to buy my first house. After years of cramped apartments and noisy neighbors, I was ready for my own space. I'm a freelance software developer, which means I work from home and value peace above almost everything else. When my realtor, Mike, showed me the property at 1847 Oak Ridge Lane, I fell in love immediately. The house was a charming 2-story craftsman with a wraparound porch, mature oak trees in the yard, and, this was the critical part, it sat on a quiet street just outside the Meadowbrook Estates subdivision. I specifically asked Mike about HOAs because I'd heard the horror stories. Friends who couldn't paint their front doors without committee approval. Neighbors are getting fined for leaving their trash cans visible for 10 minutes too long. That wasn't the life I wanted. "No HOA," Mike confirmed, showing me the property survey. "See this line? That's the Meadowbrook boundary. Your property is technically in the Oak Ridge Grove area, which has no homeowners association. You're completely independent." I had him verify this 3 times. I checked the county records myself. I even had my real estate attorney review the documents before closing. Every single source confirmed the same thing. 1847 Oak Ridge Lane was not part of the Meadowbrook Estates HOA. The closing went smoothly. I moved in on a Tuesday in late August, hiring a small crew to help me haul furniture up those beautiful wooden stairs. My home office overlooked the backyard, where I could see squirrels chasing each other through the oak branches. For 2 glorious weeks, life was perfect. Then Patricia showed up. "You have multiple violations that need immediate attention," she continued that Saturday morning, consulting her clipboard like it was the Constitution itself. "Your lawn exceeds the approved height of 2.5 inches by at least half an inch. Your vehicle is parked in your driveway overnight, which violates our street appearance standards, and you failed to submit your exterior paint color for approval before moving in." I rubbed my eyes, trying to process this absurdity. "Ma'am, I appreciate you stopping by, but I'm not part of your HOA. This property isn't in Meadowbrook Estates." Her smile didn't waver, but something cold flickered in her eyes. "Our boundaries were recently expanded. All properties within a quarter mile of our development now fall under our jurisdiction. You should have received notification in the mail." "That's not how HOAs work," I said, my voice firmer now. "You can't just claim territory like a medieval kingdom. I checked the property records. I'm not in your HOA, I didn't sign your covenant, and I don't owe you anything." Patricia's smile finally dropped. "Young man, I've been managing this community for 8 years. I know our boundaries better than some county clerk. You will comply with our regulations or you will face the consequences." She thrust a paper at me, a notice of violation with a list of infractions and a $500 fine. I didn't take the paper. "With all due respect, you need to leave my property and don't come back." Her face flushed red. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." I closed the door and stood there, heart pounding with a mixture of anger and disbelief. This couldn't be real. People couldn't just invent authority over your property, could they? Spoiler alert, they absolutely try. The next violation notice appeared in my mailbox 3 days later. This one claimed my porch furniture was non-conforming and my garden hose, which I'd left coiled by my garage, was visual pollution. The fine had increased to $750. I called my real estate attorney, David Chen. He listened to my story and actually laughed. "She's completely delusional," David said. HOAs can't expand their boundaries without a legal process that involves property owners voluntarily joining. Even if they wanted to annex your property, you'd have to agree to it and sign documents. Just ignore her. "You're sure?" "I'm positive. I've dealt with overzealous HOA boards before, but this is next level. Keep the notices as documentation in case she escalates, but you have zero legal obligation to her." Relieved, I threw myself back into work. I had 3 client projects due and didn't have time for Patricia's delusions, but she had plenty of time for me. The following Saturday, I woke up to find an orange sticker plastered across my front door. "Property condemned, HOA violation." My heart nearly stopped. I ripped it off and found Patricia standing at the end of my driveway with 2 other people. A tall man in a polo shirt who I later learned was Brad, the HOA vice president, and a thin woman with a pinched expression named Susan, the secretary. "This is your final warning," Patricia called out. "You now owe $2,000 in fines. If you don't pay by Monday and submit a compliance plan, we'll be forced to place a lien on your property." "You can't do that," I shouted back. "I'm not in your HOA." "We'll see what the courts say," Patricia replied, and the 3 of them marched back toward Meadowbrook like they'd just delivered divine justice. I called David again. He was less amused this time. "She's threatening to file a fraudulent lien," he said, his voice serious. "That's actually illegal. I'm going to send her a cease and desist letter. This has gone beyond annoying into actionable territory." David's letter went out Monday morning via certified mail. It clearly stated the legal boundaries, cited property records, and warned Patricia that further harassment would result in a lawsuit for intentional infliction of emotional distress. You won't believe what happened next. Patricia doubled down. On Wednesday, I found a construction crew in my front yard. Not a small crew, a full team with a truck, equipment, and 2 guys actively pulling up the small flower bed I'd planted near my mailbox. "What the hell are you doing?" I ran outside, still in my work clothes from a video call I'd just finished. "HOA violation removal," one of the workers said, looking uncomfortable. "We were hired to remove non-compliant landscaping." "By who?" "Meadowbrook Estates HOA. We got a work order." I was shaking with rage. "Stop! Right now! This is my property. You're trespassing and destroying my landscaping." The crew leader made a phone call, spoke in hushed tones, then turned to his team. "Pack it up." They left, but the damage was done. My flower bed was torn up and dirt was scattered across the lawn, and I'd been forced to abandon a client call that cost me professional credibility. This is where it gets good. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat at my kitchen table, David's contact information in front of me, and made a decision. Patricia Hendricks had crossed from annoying to destructive. She wasn't going to stop until I made her stop. I called David first thing Thursday morning. "I want to sue." "Good," he said. "I was hoping you'd say that. Let me do some research on this Patricia Hendricks. The more ammunition we have, the better." While David worked the legal angle, I started my own investigation. See, here's where being a software developer comes in handy. I know how to research, I know how to dig through public records, and I know how to find digital breadcrumbs that people don't realize they're leaving. I started with the county property records, pulling up not just my property, but every property in Meadowbrook Estates. The subdivision's official boundaries were clearly marked and hadn't changed since 1998. My property was approximately 200 feet outside that boundary, not even close to ambiguous. Next, I requested HOA documents through a public records request. In my state, HOA governing documents are public record if they're filed with the county. Meadowbrook's covenant was available online, and I spent an evening reading all 47 pages of bureaucratic nonsense. Nowhere did it claim authority over properties outside the subdivision. In fact, Article 3, Section 2 specifically limited the HOA's jurisdiction to properties within the platted boundaries of Meadowbrook Estates as recorded in Plat Book 47, page 23. I printed everything, highlighted the relevant sections, built a file that would make a paralegal proud. But I wasn't done yet. I started talking to my neighbors. First, I walked over to meet the Johnsons, an older couple who lived 2 houses down from me, also outside the Meadowbrook boundary. "Oh, Patricia," Mrs. Johnson said, her face souring like she'd bitten a lemon. "She tried this with us 3 years ago, claimed we needed to get approval for our new roof. We told her to pound sand and she eventually gave up." "Did she threaten legal action?" "Constantly. She sent us violation notices for months. Finally, our son, he's a lawyer, sent her a letter and she backed off. But I've heard she's tried this with at least 4 other properties on this street over the years." A pattern. This wasn't random crazy. This was systematic harassment. I talked to the Chens, the Martinez family, and old Mr. Peterson, who'd lived on Oak Ridge Lane since 1987. Every single one of them had Patricia stories, threats, violation notices, intimidation tactics. She'd been waging a guerrilla war against non-HOA properties for years, apparently convinced she could bully people into submission. But here's the thing about bullies. They rely on people being too tired, too scared, or too broke to fight back. Patricia had probably gotten away with it dozens of times because people just moved or gave up. I wasn't going to move, and I definitely wasn't giving up. Let me paint you a picture of what happened over the next 2 weeks. David filed a lawsuit against Patricia Hendricks, Brad Morrison, Susan Chen, and the Meadowbrook Estates HOA. The charges included harassment, trespassing, destruction of property, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and attempted fraud for the lien threat. The lawsuit was comprehensive, detailed, and requested not just damages, but an injunction preventing them from contacting me ever again. While that was in motion, I did something else. I set up cameras. Not little doorbell cameras. I'm talking professional-grade security cameras with 4K resolution, night vision, and motion detection. One covering the front yard, one on the back, and one on each side of the house. Everything was cloud-backed up and recorded 24/7. I also started documenting everything. Every violation notice went into a labeled folder with the date and time I received it. I took photos of my property from every angle, documenting that nothing I was doing violated any actual code or law. I even had my grass professionally measured. 2.8 inches, perfectly normal and nowhere near any municipal violation. My neighbors became allies. Mr. Peterson, who'd been dealing with Patricia for years, agreed to be a witness. The Johnsons provided their old violation notices as evidence of a pattern. Even some people from inside Meadowbrook Estates reached out, privately sharing horror stories about Patricia's tyrannical rule within her actual jurisdiction. She fined me $200 because my Christmas lights stayed up until January 3rd, one woman told me over coffee. We were allowed to have them through New Year's Day, but not a day longer. My husband was in the hospital and I was dealing with that, but she didn't care. She made us repaint our shutters because the shade of blue was too vibrant, another couple shared. We'd gotten the paint color pre-approved, but she changed her mind after we'd already painted. Cost us $800. The stories kept coming. Patricia wasn't just targeting me, she was a tyrant who'd been terrorizing an entire community. But within Meadowbrook, people had actually signed the covenant. They'd legally agreed to her authority, even if she abused it. I hadn't. And that made me her white whale. 3 weeks after filing the lawsuit, we got a court date. But before we even made it to court, Patricia made her biggest mistake. It was a Tuesday afternoon. I was on a call with a client in Singapore, a big contract worth about $30K, when I heard vehicles outside. Multiple vehicles. I glanced out my window and felt my blood pressure spike. Patricia had brought a tow truck to my property. I muted my call and ran outside. The tow truck was positioning itself behind my car, which was parked legally in my own driveway, and Patricia was directing the driver like she was conducting an orchestra. "What the hell is happening?" I demanded. "Your vehicle violates parking regulations," Patricia said calmly. "It's being towed to an impound lot until you pay your fines and compliance fees." The tow truck driver looked uncomfortable. "Sir, I was told this was an HOA violation. This isn't HOA property." I pulled out my phone and started recording. "This is my private property, and you're attempting to steal my vehicle." Patricia's face was pure ice. "The Meadowbrook Estates has full authority to enforce—" "No, you don't." I was shaking with fury, but keeping my voice steady for the recording. "This property is not part of your HOA. You have no legal authority here. Driver, if you hook up my vehicle, I'm calling the police and pressing charges for theft." The driver stepped back from my car. "Look, I don't want to be in the middle of this. Lady, if he's saying this isn't HOA property—" "It is," Patricia insisted. "Hook up the vehicle now, or you don't get paid." "Ma'am, I need to see documentation." "I'm calling the police right now," I said, dialing 911. "You're trespassing on private property and attempting vehicle theft." The dispatcher answered, and I explained the situation clearly and calmly while my camera recorded everything. Patricia's confidence finally cracked. She realized the tow truck driver wasn't going to help her, and now the police were coming. "This isn't over," she hissed at me. "You'll regret—" "Are you threatening me? On camera?" She turned and marched back to her white Mercedes SUV, tires squealing as she drove away. The tow truck driver apologized profusely and left, and I had the entire thing recorded in glorious high definition with audio. When the police arrived 15 minutes later, I showed them everything. The officer took my statement, watched the video, and shook his head. "This is harassment," he said flatly. "You want to press charges?" "I have a lawsuit already filed. But yes, I want this documented." He wrote up a report, added it to an apparently growing file about Patricia's behavior, and advised me to get a restraining order. David was practically giddy when I sent him the video. "This is perfect," he said. "She just handed us attempted theft on video. The judge is going to eviscerate her." Court day arrived on a cold Monday in October. I dressed in a suit, brought 2 folders of documentation, and met David at the courthouse. Patricia showed up with Brad and Susan, plus a lawyer who looked like he already regretted taking this case. If you're enjoying this story, hit that subscribe button because you're not going to want to miss how this ends. The hearing was in civil court, Judge Margaret Thornton presiding. Judge Thornton was in her early 60s, with silver hair and a reputation for zero tolerance for nonsense. I'd looked her up. She'd previously ruled against abusive HOAs in 3 separate cases. Patricia's lawyer opened with a statement about maintaining community standards and protecting property values. He tried to argue that Meadowbrook had a natural geographic boundary that extended beyond the legal plat and that my property was clearly intended to be part of the community. Judge Thornton interrupted him. "Counselor, are you arguing that your client has authority over property outside the platted boundaries of her HOA?" "We're arguing that community standards. That's a yes or no question." Patricia's lawyer hesitated. "The boundaries are somewhat ambiguous." "They're not ambiguous," David said, standing up, holding a stack of documents. "Your Honor, the property records are crystal clear. My client's property at 1847 Oak Ridge Lane sits 200 feet outside the Meadowbrook Estates plat. The HOA covenant, which I've submitted as Exhibit A, specifically limits jurisdiction to properties within that plat. There is no ambiguity." Judge Thornton reviewed the documents. Her expression grew increasingly stern. "Ms. Hendricks," she said, looking directly at Patricia, "did you threaten to place a lien on Mr. Thompson's property?" Patricia stood, smoothing her blazer. "Your Honor, we were simply trying to enforce— Did you or did you not threaten to file a lien? We communicated the consequences of noncompliance." "That's a yes," Judge Thornton made a note. Did you hire a construction crew to remove landscaping from his property? The landscaping was non-compliant with our aesthetic standards. Did you hire a crew to remove landscaping from property you don't have authority over? Patricia's lawyer touched her arm, trying to get her to stop talking, but she pushed forward. Your Honor, if we don't maintain standards, the entire community suffers. Did you or did you not attempt to have Mr. Thompson's vehicle towed from his own driveway? Silence. Ms. Hendricks, I'm waiting for an answer. We arranged for the removal of a vehicle that was in violation. David stood again. Your Honor, I have video evidence of this incident. He pulled out his laptop and played the footage. The courtroom watched as Patricia directed the tow truck driver, threatened me, and fled when police were called. Judge Thornton's face could have frozen lava. Ms. Hendricks, she said, her voice dangerously quiet. You have engaged in systematic harassment of a property owner over whom you have no legal authority. You've threatened fraudulent liens. You've destroyed private property. You've attempted to have a vehicle stolen. And you did all of this despite receiving a cease and desist letter from Mr. Thompson's attorney, clearly explaining that you had no jurisdiction over his property. Your Honor, I was acting in good faith. There is nothing good faith about any of this. Judge Thornton turned to Patricia's lawyer. Counselor, I strongly suggest you advise your client to settle this case immediately. Because if this goes to trial, I can guarantee you the outcome will be significantly worse. The settlement conference happened during a recess. Patricia's lawyer basically begged David to name terms. The lawsuit had exposed not just the harassment of me, but Patricia's pattern of behavior that could open the HOA up to multiple additional lawsuits from other property owners she'd targeted over the years. David's terms were simple. 1. Patricia, Brad, and Susan would issue a formal written apology acknowledging they had no authority over my property. 2. The HOA would pay $15,000 in damages, $5,000 for the destroyed landscaping, $5,000 for emotional distress, and $5,000 for my attorney fees. 3. Patricia, Brad, and Susan were prohibited from contacting me, coming onto my property, or sending any violation notices for any reason. Permanent restraining order. 4. The HOA would send a formal letter to every property owner on Oak Ridge Lane clarifying that properties outside the Meadowbrook plat were not subject to HOA authority and apologizing for any previous harassment. 5. Patricia would resign as HOA president within 30 days. That last one wasn't David's idea. It came from the HOA's lawyer, who'd apparently been waiting for an excuse to remove Patricia from power. Turns out her reign of terror had made her deeply unpopular, even among the board members who'd previously been too scared to oppose her. Patricia looked like she'd swallowed a handful of thumbtacks. She tried to argue, but her lawyer cut her off. Sign it, he told her, or the judgment will be 3 times worse and you'll personally be liable for fraud charges. She signed. Judge Thornton approved the settlement agreement, made it a court order, and added one more thing. Ms. Hendricks, the judge said, if you violate this order in any way, if you so much as drive past Mr. Thompson's property, you will be held in contempt of court. Do you understand? Yes, Your Honor, Patricia said through clenched teeth. We left the courthouse, and I felt like I could finally breathe. David was grinning ear to ear. That was one of the most satisfying cases I've ever worked on, he said. Usually these things settle quietly. Getting a judge to tear down an abusive HOA president publicly, that's rare. The check arrived within a week. The written apology was a masterpiece of legally required humiliation. Patricia's signature at the bottom must have physically hurt her to write. And true to the settlement terms, every property owner on Oak Ridge Lane received a letter from the HOA's lawyer clarifying jurisdictional boundaries and apologizing for any confusion. But the fallout was beginning. Within Meadowbrook Estates, Patricia's forced resignation triggered a revolution. Homeowners who'd been living under her tyranny for years suddenly realized they didn't have to. An emergency HOA meeting was called. I heard about this from the woman who told me about the Christmas lights fine, and the residents voted to overhaul the board completely. Brad and Susan were removed. New, reasonable people were elected. And the HOA bylaws were amended to add checks on presidential power, require board votes for any fines over $100, and establish an appeal process for homeowners who felt they'd been unfairly targeted. Patricia's reputation in the community was destroyed. The story spread through local social media groups, not because I shared it, but because dozens of her former victims started sharing their own stories. Someone created a Facebook group called Patricia's HOA Survivors that gained 200 members in 3 days. She moved out of Meadowbrook Estates 6 months later. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that she'd sold her house at a loss to escape the social consequences of what she'd done. Nobody would talk to her. Nobody would serve on committees with her. She'd become persona non grata in the community she'd once ruled like a fiefdom. As for me, life got remarkably peaceful. I finished my landscaping, planting new flowers where Patricia's hired crew had torn them up. I painted my front door a cheerful navy blue that I loved. I let my grass grow to a luxurious 3 inches. And nobody said a damn word because nobody had the authority to. My neighbors on Oak Ridge Lane became genuine friends. We started having monthly block parties, ironically, more community-focused than anything happening in the actual planned community next door. Mr. Peterson grills burgers. The Johnsons bring a homemade pie. The Martinez kids play in the street while adults watch and laugh. The camera system stayed up, just in case. But the only thing they've captured in the past months is neighborhood cats and the occasional deer wandering through my backyard. I poured the $15,000 settlement into my business, upgrading my home office equipment and taking on bigger clients. The Singapore contract I almost lost during the tow truck incident? They were so understanding about the interruption that they sent me 2 more projects worth $50,000 combined. Sometimes I see people driving slowly past my house from Meadowbrook, and I wonder if they're looking at the property that brought down their HOA president. I keep my yard nice, not because I have to, but because I want to. I'm respectful of my neighbors, not because someone's threatening fines, but because that's how communities actually work. And every time I pull into my driveway, parking overnight in violation of absolutely nothing, I feel a little surge of satisfaction. Here's what I learned from this whole experience. Boundaries aren't just suggestions. They're not arbitrary lines drawn by bureaucrats to make life inconvenient. They're essential definitions of where your rights end and someone else's begin. And when someone tries to erase those boundaries, tries to extend their power into spaces they have no right to control, you have every right to defend yourself. Patricia Hendricks thought she could expand her little empire through sheer force of personality and aggressive violation notices. She thought that if she acted confident enough, official enough, people would comply. And for years, it probably worked. People moved or paid fines they didn't owe, or just lived in misery under her manufactured authority. But boundaries exist for a reason. Legal boundaries, property boundaries, personal boundaries. The law was on my side not because I was special, but because I was right. I hadn't done anything wrong. I'd bought property outside an HOA's jurisdiction, verified that fact multiple times, and attempted to live peacefully. Patricia's harassment was never about legitimate authority. It was about control. Standing up to her wasn't easy. It cost me money, time, and more than a few nights of stress-induced insomnia. But it was worth it not just for me, but for every person on my street who'd been harassed before and every future property owner who won't have to deal with Patricia's manufactured violations. There's a broader lesson here about how we handle people who abuse power. Whether it's an HOA president, a bad boss, a controlling family member, or anyone else who thinks they can bulldoze over your rights, sometimes the only way to stop them is to stand firm and make them face consequences. Patricia probably still thinks she was in the right. People like that rarely have moments of self-reflection where they realize they've been the villain. But she learned that her tactics don't work on everyone, and that the legal system, when properly used, protects people from exactly the kind of abuse she was dishing out. My story went semi-viral in local real estate circles. I've had 3 different people reach out asking for David's contact information because they're dealing with similar HOA overreach situations. One guy's HOA is trying to claim his detached garage, which was built before the HOA even existed, violates current standards. Another woman is fighting a $5,000 fine for a vegetable garden that the HOA decided was unsightly. I've shared my documentation strategy with all of them: cameras, written records, attorney consultation, and refusal to be bullied. And I've emphasized that you can't let these people exhaust you into submission, because that's their real weapon. Not legal authority, but the grinding exhaustion of constant conflict. They're betting you'll give up because fighting back is hard. But I'm living proof that fighting back works. My house on Oak Ridge Lane is more than just property now. It's a symbol, a reminder that you don't have to accept someone else's delusional authority over your life, that boundaries matter and are worth defending, that bullies, whether they're wearing blazers and carrying clipboards or not, can be stopped. And you know what the best part is? Every morning, I wake up in my home, my actual, legal, uncontested home, and I don't have to worry about violation notices. I don't have to get pre-approval for planting flowers. I don't have to measure my grass with a ruler. I get to live. If you're watching this and dealing with someone who's trying to claim authority they don't have, whether it's an HOA, a boss, a neighbor, or anyone else, document everything. Know your rights. Find a good attorney. And don't back down just because someone acts confident in their fake authority. The system isn't perfect, but it does work when you know how to use it. And there's something deeply satisfying about watching someone who's been abusing power for years finally face real consequences. So here's my question for you. What boundary do you need to defend in your life? What line has someone tried to cross that you need to protect? Please drop a comment and let me know. And if you enjoyed this story of justice served cold with a side of legal paperwork, make sure to hit that subscribe button for more stories about standing up to people who think they're above the rules. Because at the end of the day, nobody has authority over your life except the people you choose to give that authority to. And Patricia Hendricks? She never had mine. I thought the story ended with Patricia's resignation and my settlement check. I really did. But the universe apparently had a few more chapters to write. About 2 months after the court settlement, I was working on a database migration project when my doorbell rang. It was mid-afternoon on a Thursday, and I wasn't expecting anyone. My first instinct, conditioned by months of Patricia's harassment, was dread. But when I checked the security camera feed on my phone, I saw a man in a business suit I didn't recognize. I opened the door cautiously. "Can I help you?" "Mr. Thompson? I'm James Rutledge." He extended his hand. "I'm an attorney representing several homeowners in Meadowbrook Estates. Do you have a few minutes to talk?" This should have been my first warning that things were about to get interesting again. I invited him in, offered coffee, and we sat in my living room. James pulled out a tablet and opened a document. "I'll get straight to the point," he said. "Your case against Patricia Hendricks opened a Pandora's box. We now have 17 homeowners who want to file suit against the previous HOA board for what we believe was systematic abuse of power, arbitrary fines, and violation of their own bylaws." I blinked. 17 and counting. The Facebook group you probably heard about? It's up to 340 members now. We're documenting years of Patricia's behavior, fines that violated the HOA's own rules, selective enforcement based on personal grudges, retaliation against board members who questioned her. It's extensive. What does this have to do with me? James smiled. "We'd like you to be a witness. Your case established a clear pattern of behavior: harassment, overreach of authority, intimidation tactics. If Patricia was willing to target someone outside her jurisdiction, it demonstrates her mindset when dealing with people who were actually under her authority. Your testimony and documentation would be incredibly valuable." I thought about it for 10 seconds. "When do you need me?" Here's the thing about standing up to bullies. Once you do it successfully, you realize you have a responsibility to help others do the same. Patricia had made my life hell for a few months, but these people had lived under her thumb for years, some of them for a decade. Over the next few weeks, I met with several Meadowbrook residents. Their stories made my experience look mild by comparison. There was Margaret Chen, a retired teacher who'd been fined $3,000 for painting her shutters without approval, even though she'd submitted the color sample and received written approval. Patricia had apparently changed her mind after the work was done and claimed the approval was provisional. Robert Anderson had been fined $500 for having a political sign in his yard during election season, a clear violation of free speech that the HOA covenant explicitly protected. When he protested, Patricia added another $500 for insubordination. The Delgado family had been threatened with foreclosure over $8,000 in accumulated fines for violations that included excessive child noise, their kids playing in their own backyard, unapproved playground equipment, a swing set, and visual clutter, toys visible through a window. Every story was worse than the last, and every person had the same exhausted look, the look of someone who'd been fighting a losing battle for so long they'd almost forgotten what peace felt like. "Why didn't anyone sue before?" I asked James during one of our meetings. "Fear," he said. Patricia had been president for 8 years. She'd convinced everyone she was untouchable. People who challenged her got targeted even more aggressively. She'd fine them for things she ignored in other properties. She'd rally the board to vote against them on any request. She made examples of dissenters. That's tyranny. That's exactly what it is. And your case proved she could be beaten. The class action lawsuit was filed in December, just as the first snow started falling. 17 plaintiffs, represented by James and a team of 3 other attorneys. They were seeking $340,000 in damages, roughly $20,000 per plaintiff for fraudulent fines, emotional distress, and legal fees. But more importantly, they were seeking systemic change. The lawsuit demanded a complete audit of HOA finances, an investigation into where fine money had been spent, and reformation of the bylaws to prevent future abuse. I gave my deposition in early January. It was 5 hours of detailed questions about every interaction with Patricia, every violation notice, every threat. I brought my meticulously organized files, everything documented, dated, and categorized. The attorneys were practically salivating over my documentation. "This is exceptional record-keeping," one of them told me. "Most people throw these notices away or lose track. You've created a timeline that proves systematic behavior." "I'm a software developer," I said with a shrug. "I like data." Patricia's deposition, which I wasn't present for but heard about later, was apparently a disaster for her defense. She was combative, refused to admit any wrongdoing, and actually claimed she'd been the victim of a coordinated attack by ungrateful homeowners who didn't appreciate her service. The judge in that case, not Judge Thornton, but a different judge named Harold Pierce, reportedly had to call a recess because Patricia's own attorney needed time to convince her to stop talking. But here's where it gets really interesting. Remember how I mentioned they wanted an audit of HOA finances? The audit revealed that Patricia had been embezzling, not huge amounts. She was too smart for that. But over 8 years, she'd systematically diverted about $47,000 from the HOA's fine collection account into a separate community improvement fund that only she had access to. That fund had been used for things like expensive flowers for her own yard, billed as community beautification examples, luxury office furniture for the HOA meeting room, which was actually her home office, and a $15,000 consultant fee paid to her daughter's marketing company for a newsletter nobody remembered seeing. The homeowner's lawsuit suddenly became a criminal investigation. I was sitting at my desk working on a React component when David called with the news. "They're charging her with embezzlement," he said, and I could hear the grin in his voice. "Misappropriation of funds, fraud, and filing false financial reports. She could be looking at 3 to 5 years. I sat back in my chair, processing this. I just wanted her to leave me alone. "You opened the door," David said. But what was behind it was way worse than anyone knew. These people are calling you a hero. I'm not a hero. I just defended my property. Sometimes that's all it takes. The criminal trial happened in March. I wasn't required to testify in this one. It was focused on financial crimes, not harassment. But I attended a few days of the proceedings because, honestly, I needed to see it through. Patricia arrived each day in increasingly desperate-looking outfits, as if she were trying to project respectability while her entire world collapsed. Her husband, whom I'd never seen during any of the HOA drama, sat in the gallery looking shell-shocked. Apparently, he'd had no idea about any of it. The prosecution laid out a meticulous case: bank records, forged invoices, diverted funds. Patricia's defense attorney tried to argue that she'd been managing the money for community benefit, but the prosecution brought in resident after resident who testified they'd never seen any benefit from the Community Improvement Fund. The most damaging testimony came from Brad, the former vice president. He'd apparently been granted immunity in exchange for cooperation. He testified that Patricia had threatened him when he'd questioned some expenditures, that she'd kept financial records deliberately confusing, and that she'd told the board she had special accounting methods they wouldn't understand. It took the jury 4 hours to convict her on all counts. The sentencing hearing was in April. I didn't attend that one. I was honestly tired of spending time in courtrooms. But David sent me a text with the results. 18 months in prison, 3 years probation, $47,000 restitution, plus $23,000 in fines and court costs. She has to sell her house. I stared at that text for a long time. 18 months. Patricia Hendricks, who'd shown up at my door at 6:47 a.m. trying to fine me for grass height, was going to prison. I didn't feel victorious. I felt tired, and maybe a little sad. Not for her. She'd earned every consequence she got. But sad that it has come to this, that someone had let power corrupt them so thoroughly that they'd destroyed their own life. The civil lawsuit was settled 2 weeks later. The HOA's insurance ended up paying most of the damages, $280,000, split among the 17 plaintiffs. Patricia was personally liable for the rest, which meant she'd be paying it off for years. More importantly, the HOA underwent a complete restructuring. New bylaws were adopted that required financial transparency with quarterly reports to all homeowners, a 3-person audit committee with rotating members' board term limits. No one could be president for more than 2 consecutive years, a formal appeals process for any fine over $100. Written documentation of all violations with photo evidence. Mandatory board votes for any fine over $50. The new HOA president, a retired accountant named Gloria Martinez, sent me a thank you card. Actually, she sent thank you cards to everyone on Oak Ridge Lane. On behalf of Meadowbrook Estates, the card read, I want to apologize for the harassment you endured from our previous leadership. We are committed to being good neighbors and respecting boundaries, both legal and personal. It was a small gesture, but it meant something. The new board was trying to rebuild trust, trying to prove that HOAs didn't have to be weapons of tyranny. Life settled into a new normal. My client's work picked up significantly. The Singapore company referred me to 2 other firms in their network. The $15,000 settlement had helped, but the $30,000 in new contracts over the following months was even better. I started dating someone I met at a coffee shop. Beth, a graphic designer who thought the whole HOA saga was simultaneously horrifying and hilarious. We'd sit on my porch in the evenings, and she'd ask me to tell her another Patricia story like they were campfire tales. Tell me the one about the tow truck again, she'd say. I love that one. My neighbors on Oak Ridge Lane became genuine friends. We looked out for each other's houses, borrowed tools, and shared produce from our gardens. It was the kind of community Patricia had pretended to want, but could never create because she'd been too busy enforcing arbitrary rules. Mr. Peterson, who was 79 and still sharp as a tack, told me one evening over a beer, "You did something important, son. Not just for yourself. For everyone who's ever been pushed around by someone with a clipboard and a power trip? I just defended my property, I said, repeating what had become my standard line. That's what David Slew did, Mr. Peterson replied. Sometimes slaying dragons looks like filing lawsuits. The Facebook group, Patricia's HOA Survivors, eventually morphed into something more positive. It became a resource for people dealing with abusive HOAs across the state, sharing legal information, attorney recommendations, and documentation strategies. I'd contributed my filing system, and several people had told me it helped them win their own cases. I even got invited to speak at a local real estate law seminar about defending property rights against HOA overreach. It was weird being considered an expert on something I'd learned purely out of necessity, but the room was packed with people hungry for information about how to fight back against their own HOA nightmares. The most important thing, I told the audience, is documentation. The second most important is knowing your actual legal rights versus what someone claims they are. Third is finding an attorney who specializes in property law and isn't afraid of HOAs. During the Q&A, someone asked, "Do you regret buying your house knowing what you went through?" I thought about it. Not for a second. I love my house. I love my street. I love my neighbors. What I regret is that Patricia Hendricks thought she could extend her authority beyond its legal bounds. But that's her failure, not mine. The summer after Patricia's sentencing, Meadowbrook Estates threw a community festival. For the first time, they invited the Oak Ridge Lane residents, not as subjects of their HOA, but as neighbors. Gloria personally came to my door with an invitation. "We'd love to have you," she said. "I know there's history, but we're trying to build something better, new beginnings and all that." I went. Beth came with me. We ate grilled food, played lawn games, and I met dozens of Meadowbrook residents who approached me with quiet thank yous. "You helped us get our community back," one man told me. "You showed us we didn't have to live in fear," a woman said. "My kids can play in the backyard again without me worrying about fines," another parent shared. It was humbling. I hadn't set out to be anyone's hero. I just wanted to live in peace in a house I'd legally purchased outside an HOA's jurisdiction. But sometimes standing up for yourself creates ripples that reach farther than you ever intended. I heard through the grapevine that Patricia served 13 months of her 18-month sentence and was released on good behavior. She moved 3 states away. I have no idea what she's doing now, and honestly, I don't care. She's no longer my problem or anyone else's in this community. The house on Oak Ridge Lane is still my sanctuary. My security cameras are still recording, though they've never caught anything more suspicious than the UPS guy leaving packages. My grass grows to whatever length it wants, usually around 3 inches because I actually like a neat lawn, but now it's my choice. I've added to the landscaping every year. Roses along the fence, a Japanese maple near the mailbox, a small vegetable garden in the backyard where I grow tomatoes and peppers that I share with neighbors. Last month, a young couple bought the house 2 doors down from me. They're first-time homebuyers, excited and nervous. I went over to introduce myself and welcome them to the street. "Is it true?" the husband asked. "The story about the HOA president who tried to take your house?" I laughed. "It's true, but much less dramatic than the neighborhood legend probably makes it sound." "Everyone says you're the reason Meadowbrook got better," the wife said. "That you stood up to her when no one else could." "I just defended my property," I said again, "but yeah, it worked out." "Any advice for new homeowners?" they asked. I thought about everything I'd learned. Know your boundaries, know your rights, document everything, and don't let anyone make you believe they have authority they don't actually have. Also, get good security cameras. They laughed, but I was serious about the cameras. As I walked back to my house that evening, I looked at Meadowbrook Estates across the way. Kids were playing in yards without fear of noise complaints. Homeowners had planted gardens without needing committee approval. Someone had painted their front door a cheerful yellow. The community Patricia had tried to rule with an iron fist had transformed into something healthier. Not because she'd left, but because people had finally realized they had the power to demand better. My part in that transformation was accidental. I was just a guy who wanted to work from home in peace, who did his research before buying property, and who refused to be bullied by someone wielding fake authority. But that could be how most change happens. Not through grand gestures or master plans, but through ordinary people saying no when someone tries to push them around. The HOA Karen, who threatened to seize my property, taught me something valuable, though she probably wouldn't appreciate the irony. She taught me that boundaries matter, that documentation is power. The legal system, for all its flaws, does protect people who know how to use it, and that standing up to a bully, even when it's exhausting and expensive, is always worth it. Not just for you, but for everyone who comes after. So yeah, Patricia Hendricks tried to seize my property after I bought a house outside her jurisdiction. She failed spectacularly, lost everything, and went to prison. And I'm still here, in my house, on my street, living exactly the life I wanted when I signed those closing papers. That's not revenge, that's just justice. And honestly, justice feels pretty damn good.